In the bitter winter of 1756, deep along the winding banks of the James River in colonial Virginia, tragedy struck the Calverton family. Inside their remote plantation house, 7 members of this wealthy and prestigious household perished within hours, right in the middle of what should have been a celebration dinner. The official records, which were locked away and sealed for more than 200 years, describe the scene in unsettling detail. Each victim collapsed in violent convulsions. Their tongues turned black, and from their mouths came a strange and unforgettable odor, sweet, almost pleasant, like almonds mingled with honey. But beneath that sweetness lurked a bitterness so strong it made even hardened men gag. What stunned the community most was not only the horror of the deaths, but the accused culprit, an enslaved woman named Sarah Williams, who had served the Calvertons faithfully for 15 long years. She had no history of disobedience, no signs of rebellion, no infractions at all. Nothing that would have suggested she might one day strike out in such a devastating way. Colonial officials quickly buried the case, smothering every trace of it. Records were deliberately split apart and hidden in different county archives. Testimonies were locked away by orders that lasted over 2 centuries. And what little physical evidence remained was destroyed just months later in what officials called an accidental fire. Was that fire really an accident? Or was it part of a calculated effort to erase the truth? The fragments that did survive tell a story so disturbing that even today scholars question whether the full truth was ever written down at all. Before we dive deeper into the fate of Sarah Williams and the dark secrets of the Calverton plantation, I'd like to pause for a moment. Here where I am right now, rain is tapping softly against the windows. It sets the perfect mood for a story like this. How about you? What's the weather? Like where you are tonight? Let me know in the comments below. Now back to our tale. The truth about that dinner, long thought buried, would remain hidden until 1987, when archivists stumbled upon a rotting trunk during a courthouse restoration project. Inside were water-damaged testimonies, voices from that December night finally rising again. And what they revealed shook the ground beneath Virginia's history. They spoke of sophisticated resistance networks woven through the enslaved communities. Networks so advanced, so quietly organized, that their existence terrified the colonial elite far more than any open rebellion. The Calverton plantation itself was no ordinary estate. It sprawled across 3,000 acres of fertile tobacco fields in Charles City County, where the James River coiled through the countryside like a brown serpent carrying the riches of Virginia toward the Atlantic. In 1756, this region was the very heart of America's tobacco empire, a place where enormous fortunes were carved from the soil, but always on the bent backs of enslaved Africans. The humid climate was perfect for the golden leaf, and under the relentless discipline of forced labor, the crop thrived. The plantation embodied everything the colonial gentry dreamed of, an imitation of English aristocracy, transplanted to American soil, polished with wealth and power, but rooted in violence and bondage. At its center stood the Calverton Mansion. Built in 1721, it was an imposing brick Georgian structure with twin chimneys and 12 perfectly symmetrical windows staring out over endless rows of tobacco. It was more than just a house. It was a monument to English ambition, constructed brick by brick by enslaved craftsmen. These artisans, whose skills in carpentry, masonry, and brick-making stretched back generations, had no choice but to create the very edifice that symbolized their captivity. The Calverton Mansion was more than a house. It was a stage where wealth, power, and appearances performed daily. Its imported glass windows glittered in the sunlight. Its hand-carved woodwork gleamed with polish, and the formal gardens stretched outward in patterns meant to echo the great estates of England, though reshaped to suit Virginia's climate and native plants. When Edmund Calverton inherited the property in 1739, along with the 43 enslaved souls who labored upon it, the estate was already impressive. But by the winter of 1756, he had transformed it into a small empire. At 52 years old, Edmund was known throughout Charles City County as a calculating and capable businessman. He had purchased additional land along the James River, experimented with the newest agricultural methods praised by London merchants, and as a result, his tobacco commanded premium prices overseas. Other planters across Virginia often traveled to study his techniques, admiring the ruthless efficiency with which he ran his plantation. Edmund's wife, Margaret, brought her own influence to the estate. Born into the Randolph family of Richmond, one of Virginia's most powerful dynasties, her marriage to Edmund in 1729 was as much a business pact as it was a union of affection. Her dowry funded new ventures, including rice cultivation in the fertile river bottoms. This diversification helped shield the Calverton fortune against fluctuations in tobacco prices, making the family one of the most secure and envied in the colony. Through Margaret, the Calvertons gained not just wealth, but social connections that reached deep into the planter aristocracy. By 1756, the household bustled with both family and extended kin. Edmund and Margaret lived with their 3 children, each carefully molded to preserve and extend the dynasty. There was also Margaret's unmarried sister, who played a central role in household management, and Colonel James Hartwell, Edmund's business partner, whose ties to shipping routes made him indispensable to the plantation's prosperity. The eldest son, Thomas, aged 24, had just returned from 3 years of education in London. He brought back with him ideas gleaned from the Caribbean sugar islands, innovations in crop rotation and labor management. But his father found these notions troublesome, too experimental compared to the tried and true methods of Virginia tobacco cultivation. Father and son clashed often, their arguments echoing through the grand halls of the mansion. Catherine, aged 21, was a picture of refinement, trained to embody the grace and sophistication expected of planter daughters. She studied music, French, and the domestic arts under private tutors. Her engagement to Richard Petton, son of a wealthy Richmond merchant, was not merely a romantic bond, but another calculated alliance designed to strengthen the Calvertons' grip on commerce and society. Young Edmund Jr., just 16, was a more complicated heir. His parents worried about his budding sympathies, attitudes shaped by conversations with visiting Quaker merchants. He had shown an alarming interest in egalitarian ideas and expressed unease at the suffering of the enslaved workers upon whom his family's fortune rested. To his father, these leanings were not just youthful folly, they were a direct threat to everything the Calvertons had built. Margaret's sister, Patience Randolph, aged 38, carried her own story. Once destined for marriage, a youthful scandal involving improper attention to an overseer had ruined her prospects. Unmarried and marked by gossip, she had sought refuge in her sister's household. Though she capably managed domestic affairs, her very presence was a reminder of how swiftly reputation could collapse in Virginia's rigid society. Colonel James Hartwell, Edmund's business partner, completed the circle. He controlled the ships that carried Calverton tobacco to Europe, and his links to London merchants made him invaluable. Yet his frequent visits stirred tension. He was visibly drawn to patience, and his growing sway over plantation decisions sometimes clashed with Edmund's pride and authority. Amid all these shifting relationships stood Sarah Williams. Unlike most of the enslaved workers, she held an unusual position of influence. As head cook and kitchen supervisor, Sarah oversaw not just meals, but a staff of servants controlling the flow of food and resources within the house. Born around 1720 in what is now Angola, she had been torn from her homeland during tribal warfare, sold to Portuguese traders, and shipped across the Atlantic. Her journey had first taken her to Barbados, where she endured 2 grueling years on a sugar plantation. It was there that she learned the culinary techniques and household management skills that marked her as valuable. When a Virginia merchant purchased her, she was given a new name, Sarah Hope, erasing her African identity. Soon after, the Calvertons acquired her, and over the next 15 years, she became indispensable to the smooth operation of their household. But as we'll soon discover, Sarah's position in the kitchen was more than domestic service. It was power. Quiet, subtle power. The kind that could alter the fate of an entire dynasty in a single evening. And speaking of power right now, as I read these words to you, the rain outside my window has grown heavier. The sound of it feels almost like a drumbeat setting the rhythm of this tale. How's the weather where you are calm and clear or stormy like here? The name Sarah Hope carried a bitter irony. For in truth, hope was the very thing the system of slavery was designed to crush. Yet, Sarah had preserved it, nurturing not only hope, but also intelligence and the courage to act. That defiance, quiet but determined, would one day send tremors through the world of her oppressors. Within the enslaved community, Sarah was not remembered only for her unmatched skill in the kitchen. True, her artistry at the hearth had made the Calverton dining table famous across Charles City County. Guests often remarked that her meals rivaled the grandest households of Williamsburg and Richmond. But her true distinction lay in something far more dangerous, her apparent literacy. For an enslaved person in colonial Virginia, to read and write was a crime, a threat, a spark that could ignite rebellion. Owners understood too well that literacy meant communication planning and the ability to pass ideas from one to another like whispered embers. To them, it was nothing short of poison to the system of control. And yet, Sarah somehow had learned. She carried within her the most dangerous tool imaginable, knowledge. Life on the plantation itself was organized with a brutal efficiency that had become routine. The rhythms of forced labor were relentless beginning before the sun had even cracked the horizon. Fires had to be kindled, meals, prepared tools readied. Then the endless march into the fields. The work of tobacco was exacting and unyielding planting. In neat beds, transplanting seedlings, weeding, cutting off blossoms, harvesting leaves at just the right moment, and curing them in barns where temperature and humidity had to be watched with hawk-like precision. A single mistake could ruin the crop, and ruin meant punishment. When winter slowed the farming, the enslaved were not idle. They mended tools, preserved food, laid supplies for the spring, and kept the machine of the plantation running. There was no season of rest, and for any misstep, punishment came swiftly. Edmund himself sometimes wielded the whip, but more often the task fell to his overseer, Jeremiah Cook. Cook was a man whose name carried dread. Imported from South Carolina rice plantations, he had honed his reputation for discipline with what were called creative cruelties. Even among whites, the specifics of his methods were whispered, not spoken aloud. His punishments broke the body but stopped short of destroying valuable property. He had been hired precisely because of this grim efficiency. The winter of 1756 struck the Calverton estate with unusual harshness. An early frost in October devastated a portion of the tobacco harvest, slicing into the family's profits. At the same time, debts from Edmund's ambitious land purchases came due. The result was a blow that even Edmund's careful business dealings could not soften. To raise quick cash, he did what men like him always did. He sold people. 2 entire families were torn from the community and shipped south to rice plantations in Carolina. Mothers ripped from children, husbands from wives. The cries of separation echoed long after the wagons rolled away. For the enslaved who remained, it was a brutal reminder their lives could be shattered at the stroke of a pen, reduced to mere figures in a ledger. Anxiety hung in the air like a storm cloud. Families who had endured together for years now lived with the gnawing fear that tomorrow might end it all. Every act of kindness, every shared meal, every whispered prayer was shadowed by the knowledge that it could vanish in an instant. By the final weeks of that December, the pressure within the Calverton plantation was reaching its breaking point. And speaking of December nights, I can still hear the steady rain outside my own window. It feels almost like a backdrop, an echo of the tension building in this story. I wonder where you are. Is the night calm, or can you hear the patter of rain as well? Thomas Calverton had returned from England with more than just a polished accent. He carried with him extravagant tastes and ideas that clashed at every turn with his father's methods. In London and the Caribbean, he had studied what he called modern plantation management, a system of ruthless efficiency that demanded more labor, tighter schedules, and above all, more enslaved people. He urged his father to adopt these practices to expand production beyond what Virginia traditions allowed. But Edmund was unwilling. The debts already weighed heavy, the frost had crippled the harvest, and the family finances could not shoulder new investments. Father and son argued bitterly, each meal turning into a debate, each encounter laced with the quiet strain of unspoken resentment. Catherine, meanwhile, faced her own turmoil. Her engagement to Richard Peyton, once paraded as a brilliant match, had soured into a negotiation. The Peyton family merchants, rather than planters, demanded guarantees, dowries, inheritances. Financial assurances that Edmund was reluctant to grant, while his accounts sagged under debt. Catherine, herself proud and conscious of her status, began to waver. To her, marrying a merchant's son felt like stepping downward away from the aristocratic ideals her family had so carefully cultivated. And then there was young Edmund Jr., the boy who asked dangerous questions. He had been caught more than once playing with enslaved children, his friendships blurring lines that his father considered essential to authority. He spoke openly of morality, even wondering aloud whether slavery was just. To the elder Edmund, this was not only unacceptable, it was perilous. Such talk could spread, could weaken control, and worse, still could make his family appear soft in the eyes of their peers. All of these tensions swirled beneath the surface as December 15th, 1756 dawned bitter cold. Frost clung to the bare branches of oaks lining the quarter-mile drive to the Calverton mansion. The air cut sharp and thin, threatening the last of the winter vegetables in the gardens. Enslaved workers rose in darkness to tend fires to guard precious stores against the freeze, to keep life moving under the weight of cold and command. Inside the mansion, preparations began for what Edmund had declared would be a celebration dinner. Officially, it marked the close of the harvest. But in truth, it was something more, a chance to steady the family's slipping fortunes, to gather with Colonel Hartwell and discuss the financial lifeline his shipping networks provided. It was a dinner of appearances strategy and decisions that would ripple through every life on the plantation. At the center of this preparation stood Sarah. For 3 days, she had worked with meticulous care, aware from overheard conversations that this was no ordinary meal. She slaughtered a prize pig, raised for the occasion gathered preserved vegetables from the plantation's stores, and unlocked Margaret's carefully guarded pantry for raw spices treasures from across the Atlantic. That elevated plantation dining above the fare of small farmers. The menu was a masterpiece of both abundance and precision: roasted pork stuffed with herbs from the garden, sage, thyme, rosemary, sweet potato pudding laced with molasses and spice, cornbread enriched with butter and eggs, winter greens simmered with bacon and vinegar, and as the final crown, a rice pudding delicate perfumed with cinnamon and vanilla, a dish so rare and difficult that only the most skilled cooks in Virginia could perfect it. Later, in testimony preserved by Magistrate William Braddock, Sarah recalled the day with astonishing clarity. She rose at 4 a.m, stoking the fires of the great kitchen hearth, turning the spit by hand, adjusting the flames so the pork would roast evenly through the long day. Every detail mattered. Every dish had to be flawless. The kitchen itself was a separate building, linked to the house by a covered walkway. It was common practice, safer in case of fire, and convenient for the plantation gentry who preferred to keep the sights, smells, and sweat of labor at arm's length. That separation, the distance between where the food was made and where it was served, would later become a chilling clue. For whatever had been added to the meal that night touched only the Calvertons and their guests. Not one member of the kitchen staff nor a single enslaved worker suffered the fate of the family. And here we pause just for a breath. As I tell you this part of the story, I can still hear the steady rhythm of rain outside. It's strange, isn't it? How weather shapes mood. Here the rain feels heavy, almost foreboding. What about where you are? Is it quiet and still, or does the world outside your window carry its own warning signs? The walkway linking the kitchen to the great house had always seemed ordinary, just a covered path between heat and refinement. But on that December day, it became a stage, an open corridor, where glances, whispers, and unseen hands could intervene. Unlike a house with an integrated kitchen, this separation created shadows of opportunity moments that would later take on dreadful significance. As the afternoon stretched long and cold, Sarah recalled seeing things that unsettled her. She would repeat them again and again, under interrogation, each detail etched into memory. Master Edmund came to the kitchen not once but twice. In 15 years of her service, he had never shown such interest in her work. Yet, now he lingered, questioning her about the herbs, the spices, even the precise timing of each course. His eyes lingered on jars and measures as though searching for something more than flavor. Then Margaret entered another rarity. Her composure, usually as steady as the locked pantry she guarded, seemed brittle. She fussed over seasonings, demanded adjustments, asked again and again. "Will it be ready by 6? It must be ready by 6? Sarah saw in her mistress's face not control but distraction, perhaps even fear. And strangest of all, Colonel Hartwell. A man of ship's ledgers and tobacco contracts, he suddenly found time for a private kitchen tour. He examined the great hearth, peered into storage bins, questioned her on food preparation and safety. His curiosity seemed almost theatrical, as though his interest lay not in cooking, but in what could be hidden within it. By 6 o'clock, as the sky surrendered to winter dark and candles burned in the mansion's windows, the dinner began. The mahogany table, polished to a sheen, seated 7 its arrangement, more than formality, for in Virginia society, where one sat reflected one's rank, one's power, one's destiny. Dishes came forth one by one, their aromas rich, their flavors layered, each course a tribute to Sarah's mastery. But before the night ended, this gathering would no longer be remembered as a feast. It would be spoken of in hushed tones as the Calverton Massacre. By midnight, the screams had fallen silent. Jupiter, loyal and terrified, rode through the frost-bitten night to summon the magistrate. Within hours, armed men from neighboring plantations arrived, their torches throwing wild shadows on the walls as they locked every enslaved person under guard. Fear spread like wildfire. Was this a single act of rebellion, or the opening strike of a wider conspiracy that threatened the entire plantation order? Before dawn, Magistrate William Braddock reached the estate, accompanied by Dr. Samuel Hayes, the county's lone trained physician, and Reverend Thomas Whitfield, who often doubled as coroner in these rural deaths where science was scarce. The 3 men stepped into the dining room and were struck dumb. What they found defied their knowledge of both medicine and control. The bodies bore signs of poisoning, but not like any they had seen before. The symptoms twisted, their understanding suggested knowledge and techniques that enslaved people were never supposed to possess. And suddenly, the most unsettling question rose: if such knowledge existed, then what else might be hidden, waiting just out of sight? Outside my window, the rain continues to patter, seeming to match the tense atmosphere of the story. I wonder what's it like where you are. Is it quiet, or are there some background noises that add to the chill? The 7 bodies lay where death had struck them, twisted into unnatural postures, faces frozen in grimaces of unspeakable pain. Yet something was wrong, or rather something was missing. The familiar signs of colonial Virginia's known poisons were absent. No foaming mouths, no violent retching, no livid skin tones that marked mercury or arsenic. Instead, there was something eerier, a blackening of the tongues, and a faint but unmistakable perfume of bitter almonds, lingering like a ghost in the candlelit air. Dr. Hayes bent low, his training limited, but his curiosity burning. He had studied European medical texts, apprenticed in Williamsburg for 7 years, but nothing in his colonial experience prepared him for this. These deaths echoed descriptions of rare poisons. He had only read about compounds derived from tropical plants far from Virginia's soil. The notion was staggering. Had knowledge of such exotic substances somehow crossed the ocean and found its way into the hands of the enslaved, Magistrate Braddock wasted no time. He understood that this was not simply about the Calverton family. This was about the stability of the entire slave system. If one plantation could fall to poison, what message did that send to hundreds of others? His questioning was harsh, his tone ruthless. Fear was the weapon he wielded, determined to crack open any secret that might hint at conspiracy. Under this pressure, voices emerged reluctantly, painting a picture more terrifying than any single act of rebellion. Sarah, 28 years old, sharp literate and always close enough to overhear, spoke of the Calverton household's internal fractures. She told of Edmund and Thomas' father and son clashing in escalating arguments. Thomas had returned from England with ideas, expensive ones, more land, more enslaved workers, more ambitious, curing houses modeled after Caribbean estates. But dreams required silver, and silver was running thin. To raise funds, Thomas suggested selling more enslaved families south. Even more chilling was Sarah's admission that Edmund had privately considered selling her. 15 years of service, a cook whose skill had given the plantation prestige, yet he viewed her as aging stock replaceable. Worse, he feared her literacy, her ability to read and write, calling it dangerous. A spark that might ignite rebellion, and Sarah was not the only witness. Moses, the blacksmith, broad-shouldered, scarred from years at the forge, added another layer to the hidden story. He revealed that Sarah had built something secret, something forbidden, an underground school, using scraps of almanacs, torn pages of discarded newspapers, even fragments of religious texts. She had been teaching enslaved men, women, and children letters and numbers. They gathered in forgotten barns, shadowed corners of the quarters, and in the woods, under cover of wood gathering. A web of knowledge spun silently under the nose of overseers had been growing for years. The investigators exchanged glances. This was no mere cook with kitchen gossip. Sarah was a teacher, a leader, a dangerous mind, and if she had been capable of building a network of literacy in secret, what else might she have built in silence? The education network had grown quietly, spreading like roots underground. More than a dozen men, women and children now carried scraps of letters and numbers in their heads, tools that could just as easily keep accounts as they could plan escape routes, calculate distances, or coordinate resistance. Knowledge itself had become contraband, and Sarah was the smuggler. But Moses' testimony revealed something darker. In the weeks leading up to the Calverton dinner, Sarah had asked for access to areas normally outside her domain. She collected herbs and roots from the forest, explaining they were for medicinal teas and poultices. No one questioned her planters preferred enslaved people to tend their own illnesses rather than call for expensive white doctors. She had also been granted permission to clean storage sheds holding the plantation's most dangerous substances: rat poison, mercury solutions for tools, arsenical compounds for crops. To the Calvertons, these were practical supplies. To Sarah, they were possibilities. When Magistrate Braddock finally faced her in formal interrogation, he expected tears, denial, perhaps begging. Instead, he encountered something altogether different, a woman calm, self-possessed, and sharper than any enslaved voice he had ever heard. Her bearing unsettled him. She spoke in clear, measured English, her sentences polished, her vocabulary refined. It was not just literacy. It was education, the kind one gained from years of listening, of reading forbidden scraps of thinking, deeply about justice and human dignity. Braddock's questions came sharp, but Sarah parried them with grace. Yes, she had prepared the meal exactly as she had for 15 years. Yes, she had used the spices at Mrs. Calverton's own request with the key handed to her directly. No, she had added nothing unusual, and every step of her cooking could be vouched for by other servants who had watched her at work. She gave a timeline so precise, so corroborated, it seemed airtight. If poison had entered that food, she made it appear impossible that she was the one to add it. For the officials, the experience was surreal. They had entered the chamber expecting to confront a criminal. Instead, they felt as though they were being outmaneuvered by a lawyer. Sarah's testimony was not merely defense, it was strategy, as though she had studied the very laws designed to condemn her. But Braddock was seasoned. He had seen enough whispers of rebellion across Virginia to know that resistance was never random. It grew from seeds carefully sown. And he believed Sarah was no mere cook. Over the following days in the punishment cell, where cold stone walls leached the strength from the body, he pressed harder. Starvation, exhaustion threats to those she might care about his arsenal was psychological as much as physical. Still, Sarah did not break. And in the end, the crack in the case came not from her lips, but from Dr. Hayes, working alone in the ice house. There by candlelight among the stiffening bodies, he cut open stomachs, studying the contents with the grim patience of a man desperate for answers. It was then he noticed them, tiny brown fragments bitter on the tongue, releasing that same faint almond scent that had haunted the dining room, something far rarer than arsenic. Something Virginia's planters had never imagined could reach their tables. The fragments pulled from the victims' stomachs gave investigators their first undeniable clue. At last, there was proof of how the poison had entered the meal. But with proof came even greater mystery. Dr. Hayes, meticulous as ever, sealed the strange brown pieces in alcohol and dispatched them to Williamsburg, where a colleague versed in European medical texts might provide answers. 2 weeks later, the response arrived, and it shook the investigation to its core. The fragments his colleague wrote came from the seeds of a wild Virginia plant, one long known in whispers of indigenous medicine and enslaved folk remedies. In tiny doses, it eased pain and calmed fevers. But in the concentrated form Hayes had uncovered, it transformed into a silent executioner. This was not accident nor impulse. It was chemistry. It was knowledge. Sarah, the quiet cook, had not simply tossed arsenic into stew out of rage. No, she had studied. She had experimented. She had over months or even years learned how to harvest, refine, and weaponize a plant growing unnoticed in the forests around the plantation. Such work required patient secrecy and a scientific mind. The realization chilled the investigators. They had underestimated her entirely. The case darkened further when men spurred by testimonies torn from Moses and others under brutal questioning scoured the plantation's edges. In an abandoned tobacco-curing barn, far from the Calverton family's eyes, they stumbled upon Sarah's hidden world. Beneath a false floorboard lay a cache that spoke not of desperation, but of long-term design. There were dozens of dried plants, each neatly wrapped, carefully tagged with notes in English letters, mixed with African symbols the whites could not read. This was no random stash, this was a laboratory. The specimens stretched far beyond the fatal poison. They included roots and leaves from across Virginia's forests, with annotations about their potency, preparation, and effects when tested on animals. Some entries bore exact measurements, concentrations, and even seasonal cycles of toxicity knowledge far beyond what colonial physicians imagined an enslaved woman could ever grasp. And then came the most staggering find: a journal, handwritten page upon page in clear English. It chronicled years of work, observations, experiments, failures, and refinements. Here was a record that mirrored the rigor of European science, filled with details of plant chemistry interactions, of compounds, systematic trials. The investigators flipped through it in disbelief, each page another blow to their assumptions. Sarah was no servant dabbling in herbs. She was a botanist, a chemist, a thinker whose forbidden education had flourished in secret. The journal revealed not just a rebellion of the body, but of the mind, a defiance that reached far beyond a single night's massacre. It is still drizzling outside. I don't know if it is raining where you are listening to this story, but imagine. In an old tobacco warehouse, the yellow light of a lantern shines on dry branches and neatly written diary pages. Would you see it as evidence of a crime or a trace of a buried genius? Sarah's journal proved she had not acted on impulse. For more than 3 years, she had run her own shadow laboratory, capturing rats, rabbits, and small creatures from the plantation grounds and using them as test subjects. Her records showed precision that mirrored trained European science calculations of weight, dosage, and method of delivery. She measured powders, compared cooking techniques, and noted with clinical detachment the subtle signs between sickness and death. One entry, dated only months before the fatal dinner, read with a cold precision that made investigators' blood run cold. The bitter seeds show greatest promise when ground to finest powder and mixed with strong sweet substances that mask both taste and scent. Test subjects died quickly with larger doses, but smaller amounts produce only temporary sickness, followed by recovery. Further testing required to determine optimal dosage for subjects weighing approximately 150 to 200 lb. The characteristic almond scent remains detectable, but can be successfully hidden by honey molasses and strong spices when properly combined. Yet, between the lines of scientific notes lay something more haunting. Scattered reflections, deeply personal, revealed the anguish and fury that had slowly boiled into a storm. She wrote of children torn from their parents' arms, of women subjected to overseers' brutality of the lashings, the humiliations, the small daily cruelties that crushed the human spirit. Every observation carried the weight of someone who had been forced to watch, unable to stop the endless grind of suffering. Sarah's writing burned with the clarity of despair. Religion offered no mercy. The law, no protection. The courts saw her not as a woman, but as property. Even her intellect, her ability to read, reason, and reflect, was treated as a threat that had to be stamped out. One passage penned just weeks before the fatal feast left the magistrates pale as they read aloud in the cold chamber. Master Edmund speaks again of selling me to the Carolina rice fields, where the work kills most within 5 years, and where families are separated as easily as livestock. After 15 years serving his table, keeping his family's secrets, tending his children in sickness, he would discard me like broken pottery, simply to raise money for his son's wasteful schemes. But I have learned the power that grows wild in Virginia's forests. And I have learned that justice sometimes requires terrible choices that good people should never have to make. The investigation revealed that Sarah's plotting had begun nearly 2 years earlier, around the very time Edmund first mentioned selling off his less productive slaves to fund agricultural improvements. Patiently, she used her role as head cook to gather intelligence, the family's tastes, their dinner patterns, the timing of their meetings, and the occasions when every decision-maker would be seated together at one table. December 15th was no accident. It was the culmination of strategy planning and observation. Sarah chose that date because it aligned with the family's seasonal business gathering when Edmund, Margaret, Thomas, and the rest of the household would all dine together, their power consolidated in one room. It was the single night when striking once could shatter the entire foundation of the Calverton plantation. And so what investigators uncovered was not simply an act of murder, but a war declared by one enslaved woman against the system that had crushed her life. December 15th was no ordinary date. It marked the closing of the tobacco season, when ledgers were tallied, profits calculated, and most ominously, when decisions about the futures of enslaved families were made. For Sarah, the significance went deeper. She had overheard that Colonel Hartwell himself would be present to discuss shipping and financial strategies. The evening's conversation would almost certainly turn to death's losses and the solution of selling human lives to raise cash. And Sarah had sworn to herself that she would not allow it. The case reached its most chilling revelation when Magistrate Braddock uncovered that Sarah was not a solitary avenger, but part of something far larger, a web of resistance that stretched far beyond the Calverton estate. Interrogations harsh, relentless, often inhuman forced confessions from others. Some admitted they had helped Sarah gather plants from the forest grind roots, test preparations on animals. Others revealed they had passed along snippets of overheard conversations and details of the Calverton family's routines. The colonial authorities, who had always dismissed enslaved people as incapable of higher reasoning, were shaken to their core. The conspiracy demonstrated intelligence organization and communication networks that white planters had long insisted were impossible. If Sarah and her allies could coordinate in secrecy, what other plots might already be underway across Virginia? The question alone was enough to haunt every plantation household. The greatest shock came when one of Sarah's closest allies, the quiet house servant, whose testimony had first seemed hesitant, finally broke under pressure. She revealed the existence of a clandestine intelligence network run almost entirely by enslaved women. For years, these women had been the silent witnesses in white households, carrying food cleaning rooms, tending children, all while listening, remembering and exchanging details about finances, family disputes, and business arrangements. They passed secrets like threads in a vast, unseen web. Through this underground system, Sarah had chosen her moment with surgical precision. She knew which Calverton family members would attend, which dishes they preferred, even their delicate digestive weaknesses. Every detail, what they ate when they dined, who would be present, was gathered and shared by women. No one ever noticed, and no one ever suspected. Moses too proved to be more than a mere bystander. Under questioning, he admitted that his role had been technical, modifying kitchen tools, so Sarah could grind seeds into the deadly fine powder she required, and crafting hidden compartments throughout the plantation to conceal specimens and toxins. He had also been a messenger, helping to pass coded information between different estates. The revelation that broke colonial confidence most completely was this: Moses confirmed that Sarah's network was not unique. Similar webs existed across the region. Enslaved men and women carrying produce to market, traveling for skilled work, or visiting kin had quietly spread resistance strategies from plantation to plantation. They shared knowledge of poison's escape routes and even discussed coordinated uprisings, plans never executed only because of the extraordinary risks involved. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes's chemical investigation kept uncovering unsettling truths of its own. His analysis of the poison revealed not a crude, desperate mixture, but the work of someone with startling botanical expertise. Every fragment spoke of method study and precision, a science of resistance cultivated in secrecy, hidden in the shadows of Virginia's forests and barns. What most horrified investigators was not the plant itself, but the fact that it was so ordinary. Not a rare plant from Africa or Asia, but one that grew abundantly in the forests of Virginia. Native people had used it for centuries for medicinal and ceremonial purposes. But Sarah had turned the ordinary into a terrifying weapon, one that the colonists had never imagined. The technique she developed was more than knowing which plants were poisonous. It required an understanding of chemical principles, how to extract the active ingredients, remove the odor-causing impurities, and create a fine powder that could be easily mixed into sweet dishes without leaving a trace. The drying, grinding, mixing were all done in a scientific laboratory process, making the poison both potent and difficult to detect. But the greatest fear came when officials realized the Calverton poisoning may not have been an isolated incident. When they reviewed death records from neighboring counties, they discovered that mysterious deaths in plantation families previously attributed to disease or accident suddenly took on the same characteristics as Calverton. Within a 50-mile radius, at least 3 white families had died suddenly in the past decade, and the biggest suspicion now was that these were acts of secret resistance that had never been detected. This terrified Virginia's ruling class. If people who were considered unintelligent could establish information networks, study poisonous plants, and coordinate across plantations, the entire slave economy, based on control and oppression, was suddenly shaken to its foundations. Sarah's final confrontation with Judge Braddock took place on a cold January morning in 1757 in the dark stone vaults of the Charles City Courthouse. After nearly a month in prison, Sarah realized that denying her guilt was futile. And then she spoke. Not a plea or a defense, but a confession that shook colonial history, both an explanation and an indictment of the system of slavery itself. Sarah began not with that fateful night, but with her distant childhood in Angola. She told of studying at her grandmother's feet, listening to the village nurses, midwives, and healers pass on their knowledge of plants, those that cured fevers, those that stopped bleeding, those that helped her mother give birth. All of them were meant to preserve life. Then her voice broke as she recalled being captured in a raid, sold to Portuguese traders, watching friends and family perish on the terrifying voyage known as the Central Passage. Sickness, hunger, despair all turned the hold into a floating hell. Sarah survived, but carried with her the memories that would never fade. In the Caribbean and then Virginia, she saw people in her condition slowly dying from overwork, from whips, from despair. It was in this context that a terrifying thought began to grow: the knowledge she had been taught to heal could become the means of revenge. With an uncanny composure, Sarah says that her decision to learn to read was the first step that led to her actions. Secretly picking up old newspaper clippings, discarded Bibles, tattered books, she patiently taught herself each letter. That self-education opened the door, allowing her to record, systematize, and then develop a store of botanical knowledge that even European scholars were amazed at. And so each diary entry, each experiment, each meal led her to that fateful December night. Sarah's years of secret preparation were not motivated solely by personal resentment toward the Calvertons. It was a calculated decision aimed at the heart of the machinery that had oppressed her community. By wiping out the Calvertons, including the children who would inherit the plantation, Sarah hoped to create a power vacuum, a turmoil that would scatter the slave population, allowing some to find a path to freedom or at least escape the hell they had once endured. The choice of poison was also deeply symbolic. Sarah used no foreign substances, leaving no trace of outside assistance. She chose herbs that grew right here in Virginia, concocted with a blend of African medical knowledge, indigenous experience, and years of secret experimentation. In her hands, the Virginia soil itself became her ally. The land that had been taken over now turned against those who claimed to own both land and people. The most chilling part of the confession is when Sarah describes the fateful dinner. From the kitchen window, she silently watches the Calvertons eat. There's no triumphant laughter, no gloating. Instead, a deep sadness fills her. She knows that she has crossed the moral line taught to her in her childhood. But in the maelstrom of slavery, she has no choice but to follow this bloody path. When Judge Braddock questions the other slaves who assisted, Sarah remains resolutely silent. She accepts full responsibility, once again, demonstrating her calculation and determination throughout the process of resistance. Even when death is near, she chooses to protect the community, rather than to hold on to the slim hope of survival for herself. The confession ends with a thought that silences the entire courtroom. Sarah knows for sure that she will be executed, made into a living lesson for the entire slave class. But she hoped that her actions would plant a seed, a smoldering flame, that would encourage others to find a path to liberation, however dark. She also predicted that the colonial government would respond with more intense surveillance and repression, but she asserted that the more repression, the more slavery would be exposed for its unjust and fragile nature. On February 14, 1757, Sarah was publicly hanged in the Charles City County Courthouse Square. Crowds from several counties came to witness the execution, which was designed to instill fear, to remind them that anyone who dared to challenge the existing order would pay with their lives. The authorities quickly issued a series of new ordinances, fundamentally changing the way plantation security was managed across Virginia. Slaves were now forbidden from entering the woods where they could pick poisonous plants. Any act of collecting herbs without permission was severely punished. Kitchens were to be kept under constant surveillance, and slave quarters were to be searched regularly for signs of resistance activity. The government wanted to close the story with blood, with law, with fear. But Sarah's name and her actions still resonated like an unhealed crack in the walls of slavery. When the final pages of the Hartwell Files were turned, it seemed like the picture was complete. But in fact, the closer one looked, the more the picture cracked and distorted. The remaining testimonies, pieces of paper letters, They were like broken mirrors, each reflecting a different truth, and none of them was big enough to encompass the whole picture. Were the Hartwells really victims of a genetic curse? Or were they the ones who actively created the spiral of tragedy? Some documents show that the next generation still had traces of difference, abnormal manifestations in their appearance, in their memories, and even in the nightmares they recorded. Those diary entries ended abruptly, as if an invisible hand forced them to stop, not allowing them to finish telling. This led many to believe that the Hartwell story never really ended. It just retreats into the darkness, waiting to reappear one day in another form with another name, in another family. And sometimes, when looking around at the neighbors or even in our own family tree, we can still wonder, is there a Hartwell living right next door carrying a secret that they dare not name? The story ends here, but the mysterious door does not. It is still open, inviting the listener to enter, even though we know that entering means accepting, to carry a part of the haunting that will never leave. Before ending, to ease the heavy atmosphere, I want to ask a little bit. Where I live now, it is drizzling, which sounds very suitable for telling scary stories. And where you are listening, what is the weather? Like, if you also want to continue to continue to listen to half-true, half-false stories, then subscribe to the Sleepy History Tales channel. That's how we meet again every night in new journeys with untold secrets. You just need to press a button, and then the strange, sad or creepy stories of the past will come to you again, like the knocking of time. So, I hope to see you again in the next video.